And first, before we go any further, let me acknowledge that, at least here in Darwin, we're meeting here today on the unceded lands, beautiful lands at the moment, of the Larrakia Nation. And we pay our respects to Larrakia elders, past and present, and recognise their continuing custodianship, their care for community, land, seas and knowledges of their nation. And I extend those respects to all First Nations people here today and to all of the First Nations on which CityU campuses operate. Well, today we've got a visiting academic from the University of Western Australia, Associate Professor Martin Porr. Martin is also a research future fellow with the ARC, is that right? Very recent, when did you get that?
Last year, but it started the 2nd of April. So
Okay,
yeah.
great. So Martin's a Professor of Archaeology, but also a member of the Centre for Rock Art Research and Management at the UWA. His research is concentrated on aspects related to decolonising approaches in archaeology and human evolution studies. His research is also focused on ethnographic collections research, on archaeology and human evolution studies, and on Paleolithic archaeology, particularly in Europe. He's worked in many places around the world, including Germany, Thailand, Australia, India, and the Philippines. And he is currently active in his research in the Kimberley in Western Australia. And today, I think you're drawing on that research to talk about the German ethnographic expeditions to the Kimberley that took place in the 1930s and in the 1950s, and drawing on work on a project that is considering the difficulty of repatriation of material objects back to Australia from collections overseas, and efforts to make those materials held in overseas collections accessible to traditional owners here in Australia. So it's a very topical talk for us at the Northern Institute, very relevant to our work, not only in archaeology, but across much of what we do. So welcome, Martin, and I'll leave the floor to you. There'll be questions after, and Martin will talk for about maybe 30, 40 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, Kim. Thank you so much. I also want to specifically thank Kelly for inviting me, because this is my first time in the Northern Territory, first time in Darwin, after I've been in this country of Australia for 16 years. So, so this is great to have this opportunity here. I want to start also acknowledging that I'm speaking today on the unceded traditional lands of the Larrakia people, and pay my respect to elders, both past and present, and of course their continuing care for country. So that's very important. So as I said, or it was already said, this is a presentation about the work that we're doing with communities in the Kimberley, and also want to draw attention that it contains images of Aboriginal individuals who are deceased, and then don't take photographs, please, of the presentation slides. There are many project partners, and I'm not going to talk through all of them, but they all make some appearance there. So it's a complex project that I'm talking about, and it's has been going on for a really quite a long time. So as I said, so it's actually funded, and as you know, it's always important to say who is funding it. It's actually funded, this one, by the wonderful German Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. That's the German, it's basically the German ARC. So that's funded by the German institutions, and together with the Frobenius Institute in Frankfurt, UWA, and then 3 Aboriginal corporations, As I will come back to that, Mojo Art Center and museums in Germany, in Frankfurt and in Munich, and also the WA museum. So as I said, I will come back to some of these players later, but that's quite, as you can see already, also the complexity that is involved in this. But it's also, as you just saw, communities being involved. Also really want to pay my respect to traditional owners from the Wunambal communities in the Kimberley who have given permission for this collaborative research project under their guidance. And it has been really so far a great experience. And whatever the difficulties are, and I think you just said about, it's not just about the difficulties, but it's, I mean, there are lots of logistical challenges that we're dealing with, but everyone is really, I have to say, for the whole time, was very keen for this project, and why it took so long has basically logistical reasons. So what this is about, so it's already mentioned by Kim, this is basically about the so-called Frobenius Expeditions. I will come back to that, why they are called like this. And I say expeditions, there were two phases, and I will mostly talk about this first one from where they were in the field in the Kimberley in 1938. And here it's just super quickly whereabout, and that's the Western Kimberley. This is a hugely simplified map made by one of the artists, one of the participants there, by Agnes Schulz, but it's the Western Kimberley where they were between, if you have, maybe some background in this, from Walcott Inlet up where is now Kalumburu, the mission of Kalumburu, but on the western side of the Northwest Kimberley. And that was, they were in the field in 1938. And there are many things I could talk about. And there's actually a lot of mythology, modern mythology about these expeditions, also in the rock art community. There are some really also very fascinating discoveries from that, where I can't talk much about it, but I just want to show you one example here. After they returned from the field in January 1939, they did what we think is the first ever exhibition of Aboriginal artwork in what is now the Western Australian Museum. Back then, it was the Art Gallery of Western Australia, and that was purely, as you can see here, Renaissance art, modern and Western art. And this seems to be the first time that in this context, this is the space from 1913, where then materials from this group's expedition was exhibited. And this is a page from the German archive. As I said, I'm not going to go into detail. We need to work on this, but this is a surprising outcome of what we saw. And we just need to actually work on a little bit what the impact was there. And so, as I said, it's an interesting find here. Another thing that I just want to, not say exactly get out of the way, but it's not something that I will talk about at length. But when you, of course, and that's usually a question that I get, when they were in the field in 1938, 1939, and the planning was in the 30s, coming from Germany, would of course think, what is then this kind of institutional context? What is the link to Nazism? And so this and the ideas within there. There's nothing basically hidden about this. So colleagues have worked on basically on this for a long time, but it's clear there's a few things one can say about this. They were not actually part of the racially oriented German science that was going on. And the Frobenius was on the side of this, and it has a longer tradition. It was not unproblematic, of course, when we look at that today, but they were not part of Nazi science, But and then we, from our archive that we're working with, there are also some interesting, elements that we find in the correspondence there. Here, Agnes Schulz, for example, from 1934, excuse me, there's a letter where she's saying why she did not join the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, it's one of the Nazi organizations, and were complaining that she refused to actually in there. So there was some tensions going on there. Petri was actually had to leave the Institute at the beginning of the war. So one of the participants from there, and he basically was, couldn't return for working there. But then after the war, also somebody from that expedition, from that institute, actually then vouched for him that he was not a Nazi. So what we're seeing there and it's going to be a separate thing we need to work on, and a lot of work has been happened in there, is how these individuals navigated this kind of time, So, but it's very clear, and I will show you that, for example, the members of this expedition had no interest in biological, racial dimensions. They didn't make any measurements. There was not about ancestral remains. So, and what I mentioned, where from some of the members from this expedition came back in the 50s. So Andreas Lommel was in 1938 in the Kimberley. He returned to the Kimberley, to the central Kimberley, with his wife, Katharina Lommel. They were in the field in 1955. So, and this is, again, what we need to look at slightly separately. There's some materials that are in what we're looking at is from this time, but it's not our focus at the moment. It's not the focus what I'm talking today. So in the 1938, there's more, and the material is more variable. So, but they came back, and that's why when I say the expeditions, these are these two phases, as was already mentioned. But here's also a link, in fact, to the Northern Territory, because at the same time, when Andreas and Katharina Lommel were in the Kimberley, Agnes Schulz, who was in 38 in the Kimberley, came to do her own research here in the Northern Territory. Yeah, and as you can see, I mean, I don't know, you can see that very well, but she collected lots of bark paintings. She recorded basically a lot of rock art in Gunbalanya in that area. And we're trying at the moment also with colleague Tristan Jones to set up, hopefully maybe a project very similar to the one that I'm talking about here, with a focus on here, this collection, yeah, from this. So, and we're just saying, watch this space. So maybe we'll be able to do something here. So there is actually a link. So Lommel, they actually visited Agnes Schulz when she was here, and she published actually that in 1971. So stepping back a little bit, seeing if I move time-wise, because I'm probably very bad with the time. Stepping back, we are dealing with an archive here, and the archive as such has, of course, in more recent times in social theory, has a bad reputation, So it is, and actually, when I have this slide here saying I'm a professor, I'm a lecturer, so I don't need to put the quotes in there, but this is what other people have been saying. So if there are any students here, you can't do this, you need to say, who actually forgot who said this. But this is, of course, when you say, it's an expression of governmental control, it's hegemonic instrument of the state or any other institution. It's a structuring structure. It's an instrument of epistemic violence. We talked about this yesterday, how any kind of, a lot of epistemologies, Western ones imposed on indigenous knowledge system, indigenous life worlds, can become a tool of epistemic violence. And of course, it channels things, that misrepresents things. And of course, that's what is people are very aware of this today. And this is also a reason, maybe the main focus when we look at on the European side, because this is a collection in Germany. In Germany now, in the last few years, I would say almost like finally, there's now a more intense discussion about basically repatriation of objects and other elements, archives, in German museums, because in Germany, there was for a long time no discussion about the colonial history. There was a lot of discussion, of course, about, National Socialism and all of this. And now more recently in the international context, but also in the context of the Humboldt Forum, if you have followed that a little bit, there is now also a big discussion about this going on, which is, of course, very important. This is actually happening. So this is also a little bit of that background why we're doing this project. But returning to Australia, of course, the archives have a bad reputation, but there have been lots of projects, recent and not so recent, about how we can use the archive for Aboriginal communities. How can we make this? So here's some, very great examples here from Jason Gibson and others. And so basically, how can then the archive be relevant? It's a source potentially of family histories, connection to country, cultural affirmation, continuation, survival, rediscovery, truth-telling and reconciliation, inclusion and representation of Aboriginal voices. and they can be a tool, for cultural heritage management, because then sometimes, from very technical side of things, we can see how rock art has changed, for a certain amount of time. But there is actually a lot of potential there, and I mean, a lot of you in the room probably are very much aware of this. But to be able to do that, we need to learn how to read the archive properly. So we can't just, take basically at face value what's there. We need to conduct critical research history. So we need to reconstruct the research and social processes and the context before, during, after the fieldwork, of course, depending on what kind of archive we're dealing with. Talking about now what we're dealing with here. What is actually the interests that are going in there? What are the legal context and so on, cultural restriction, personal motivations, and what is then sometimes, quite often hidden, the indigenous agency that is there. So these are all elements that we're actually trying to somehow assess in part of this project. Not that we be able to do all of this, but this is kind of really important. That's why in the title of the project, definitely it's a critical research history that has to happen if we want to use this archive in this kind of sense. So going back basically now to the beginning of the project, as I said, it's been going on for quite a while. I started at UWA in October 2008, and I very quickly came across this German connection that is there between the Kimberley and institutions in Germany. And this is then here I had an IATSIS project where I then looked at the bark paintings of this collection that was 2009, 2010. So it's the first Australian grant I actually had at that time. So as you can see, it goes now back 14 years, and that really took the time. So, but at the same time, the colleagues in Germany were actually digitizing all of the whole archive that they have. And this is also what I noticed to the thing. So that's actually, if you go online on the Frobenius Institute on their website, you find the image database where they have basically made available the whole archive they have. And of course, they were, then also interested about any kind of cultural restrictions, of course. So that's kind of something that they then worked, and they were interested in kind of links, and they're still doing this because it's a massive project. And I will show you in a second why this is, from the German side, the colleagues here at this institute, why it is such a massive project. So that was basically happening almost at the same time. And so that also then enabled me to really, access a lot of these data online and use that for discussions in the field. So, and then over time in 2015, managed to bring traditional owner here, Lea Umbegai, to Frankfurt together with colleague Kim Duen, who's an anthropologist, has 30 plus years of experience working there. Richard Kuba, he's the curator, is the archive and the manager at the Institute, and we're here at the museum because the collection is at the Institute at the University in Frankfurt, and parts are in the museum in Frankfurt. So, and as you can see here, we have all the post-it notes. We're just planning, when to do important stuff. But one of the reasons also that they did an exhibition, again, the Institute in Germany, of their whole collection. At that time, they rediscovered basically their own collection. And they made here 2016 an exhibition here in the Gropiusbau in Berlin. So this is this building here. And for this, they also then wanted to include the Australian materials, from the Kimberley in there. And as I said, I will show you later how these materials look like there. And for this is then also the first time that then materials were exhibited in the Gropiusbau with explicit permission by traditional owners, because all the time before they had no knowledge that these materials are still existing. So, and this is something then started basically a whole new phase of engagement. And so we had then other visits here about 2017. We get talks about that here, the colleagues. And then we also included visiting the museum in Munich, which is now the the Völkerkunde, the previously Völkerkunde Museum, now the Museum Fünf Kontinente, the Ethnographic Museum, because parts of the collection is also in Munich, because Andreas Lommel, he was at Frankfurt before the war, and after the war, he then worked at the museum, and he was museum director between 1957 and 1977. And so basically just after his trip, the second trip, he became director there and actually kept working there. So there's materials in this institution as well in Frankfurt and in Munich. And so this is something where we started to get a sense of what is actually available. So I just throw this in here because some of that is also funded by the German Foreign Office. So that's kind of where you try to get money from somewhere else, and they invited traditional owners, and they had then the opportunity to travel to Berlin and visit, have a lunch at the German Foreign Office there, at the Außenministerium, and we were able to visit at that time when the Humboldt Forum was just a big construction site. So I'll just put it in there, and that was before the whole controversy started. So that was a few years, but this is kind of also we're seeing what was happening there. But that project, and finally 2020, you can see 10 years after basically I start with that, we were successful with this German Research Council funded project, as said, with the title German Ethnographic Expeditions to the Kimberley, Northwest Australia, Collaborative Assessment, Research History, Interpretation of Australian Aboriginal Heritage in Digital Repatriation. So we're actually concentrating on the digital repatriation. So this is in the discussion about bushcraft, about artifacts, but that's at the moment not our main focus, and it's not also the main focus of communities. So I mean, we're open to this, but this is not so far the focus. And that has actually just wrapped up the end of March, this project, and you can see some of the very interesting archival materials. So, and as I said, what is the larger intellectual background? So I said these expeditions are always called, and also I think in the Australian folklore, the Frobenius expeditions. Yeah, and why is that? There is an institute. It's called the Frobenius Institute in Germany, and that was founded before the war by Leo Frobenius. So that's a person, and if you just look here, he actually passed away in 1938 when the expedition members were in Australia, and that was the last of many expeditions he initiated, and he basically participated in between 1904 and 1938. And he basically is a very colorful character, was very prominent in Germany. Is sometimes seen as one of the founding fathers of German anthropology, but at the same time was always a fringe figure because he never was and had never had a full academic position. So as I said, this is something we could talk about, also separately, but he basically initiated this and he founded this institute, and he basically did, as I said, these kind of expeditions, mostly into Africa, because he had a certain obsession with Africa as what he thought is the origin of culture altogether. So the origin, so that's what he was looking for. And he was very much, interested in material culture, myths, but he was also interested in rock art. And this is kind of where then the link basically came in to, our Rock Art Institute, or my interests. And he was basically at that time had this kind of worldwide view. In fact, almost worldwide view on rock art, was the only one who basically was so active in this space. And what he did is, and I said, this kind of like lots and lots of expeditions he organized for collection and for recording, mostly into Africa. I showed you. So the last one before the war in 1938 to Australia was the 22nd one that they organized. So it's a massive undertaking that is actually behind this. And so when one of the special things is what is actually, as I said, he was interested as one of the few ones at that time into a global survey into rock art. And what he did for this is actually inviting usually young, female, highly trained artists from art schools on his expeditions. Yeah. And so here are some images, and like from the 20s, from the 30s. And yes, women were at that time involved a lot into in museums, as for drawing artifacts and everything, but they rarely at that time went on these expeditions, And for him, that was important that he involved them. So it's basically always mixed gender team that is in there, and they were involved. Like here's Agnes Schulz in Zimbabwe in the copying of rock art, and they developed this kind of specific methodology where they basically repainted the art at that time in full color and in full scale. And this is something that nobody else, no other institution did. They also, used here where they basically, did what is this called in English, where you have this basically on the rubbing. Thank you. Here, of course, something that we should never do, to actually paint the chalk and everything, and then put the engravings. But basically, a lot of time they basically went in front of the art and repainted it in full color, because that was, of course, a time when color photography was not available, And so they created these kind of enormous copies of art, where they have the rock art also in full context, where everything is recorded, including the rock surface. Yeah, and that's again something that almost nobody did at that time, even in Europe. And then, and that's comes in the global level, nobody else. So that's important to understand what happened then in the Kimberley. So in the Kimberley, they were in the field between May and December 1938. They did a lot of research before. Yeah. So I mean, they knew the publications that were out, and they knew basically what we were looking for. And so basically, as I said, this is a very simplified map that Agnes Schulz actually did. But they basically stayed for a while here, and then they sent out. We can, from the original stuff, we can basically more or less reconstruct where they went, in little teams during that time. So basically, they were only in the field for 6 months, which doesn't sound a lot, but the material they actually created is actually very, very rich. And so just comparison, of course, to today's landscape of the northwestern Kimberley, and this is kind of why we, of course, involving the relevant native title groups. So this is one native title determination with 3 corporations, and that's why they actually have traveled through the 3 corporations areas. Most of that is from the central Kimberley, from Wilinggin, and a lot of it is from Aurora, from the Dambimangari, and not so much is basically here from Balangara or from Umbu, so from Wunambal Gaambera Aboriginal corporation. So that's why that's why we're working with all 3, because that's important, because it's not sometimes not clear where things are coming from or where they are located, but definitely these are the 3 that are involved. So from the side of things, that basically who was there was Helmut Petri as an anthropologist. He was the leader of the expedition, and there was Andreas Lommel, and he was basically also as an anthropologist there, and they were collecting anything that was of interest on the archaeological side of things, basically stories, marriage patterns, and so on and so on. But then what is also then, as I said, specific for that time, and it's completely unusual for this time in Australia, is there were these, as I said, these 2 artists, Agnes Schulz and Gerta Kleist. Agnes Schulz was at that time very, very experienced, and she had, experience with a lot of expeditions before. For Kleist, I think that was her 2nd time they was there, and she turned 21 in the field. And apparently lots of men during that time, they all fell in love with her. So, and one of the members of the expedition here, Douglas Fox, had apparently an affair with her in the field that was, we didn't know about, but that is in the letters that they're writing each other in the field, so because they were not in the same location all the time. And so that's kind of interesting what is happening there. But here's Lommel, and there was one student from UWA was there as well, Patrick Pentony, who then wrote a master's thesis about the dreams in Aboriginal perception in the Kimberley. And this was the little team that was in here. So Douglas Fox is American, US American, who worked for the Frobenius Institute at that time, and he was also on quite a few expeditions before. And so, as I said, the administrative context that we have, that was also the time when A.O. Neville was in charge in Western Australia. The name is probably familiar. And then also, what we can see, who are basically the Western, the European or Australian people that they interacted with. And this is something, I said I can't go into too much detail here, but we can see how they have affected basically where they could, where they couldn't go, and and some supported their field work. But for example, the Reverend Love Kanmanya is also quite famous there. They didn't like each other at all. So he was actually, Love was wanted to get them, away, and he basically obstructed their work in the area. So they definitely weren't happy there. But others, were very supportive. And they only did a short trip to Colombo, so only Fox and Petrie made that trip. So there's not that. That's why there's not much material from Wunambal Gaambera and from Balagara Aboriginal Corporation. So that's something that how we can also need to consider this: what is actually happening and what is the administrative context in which they were working. So, as I said, so this is a little bit, academic, a little bit boring, but what we wanted to do is, of course, what I showed you earlier, what we want to do with this kind of archive, working together with, traditional owners and to develop a better understanding of these kind of materials. And so, as I said, we want, digitize all of them, translate them to make them accessible to the communities in digital form. We then want to analyze or to understand what actually happens in the field. And that is both something that we do as academics, we're having that broad intellectual context, but also working with traditional owners to understand how the interactions back in the 30s or in the 50s happened in the field. And this is something we are working on, and we have some interesting results for this one as well. And also then develop the cultural protocols with the German institutions. But basically, I think I've said that already, about basically the assessment that we want to do together. And this is something that we've been doing and we continue to do. And we will show you, hopefully, I'm running out of time probably, or horribly, exhibitions out of that. So I think I just leave this here. You can see, as we know, when you have these complex projects, you have all these ambitious milestones that you have for each year. And I think actually we're doing not so badly. Some things don't work out that well, like our publication record. And we somehow wanted to do a big international workshop in there. I don't know why you come up with that idea. We didn't do that. But usually we actually were quite successful with what we wanted to do. But as I said, so that's not something I want to go into the detail, because I want to show you some other things that more, of the practical side of things. When it says like the compilation, consolidation, the extension of our archive, it's actually, as I said, we are dealing with these individuals, we have institutions, and they have all their different, basically, biographies that they follow. And so Petrie, he went after that to University of Cologne. He was professor in anthropology until the 80s, when he died in 86. And we then only now, in the last few years, found out that he actually took a lot of that original materials from that time to Cologne. And it was actually at the University of Cologne with one of his former colleagues here, Professor Tauchmann. And so, and here's when he's saying the mythical green box, where a lot of that material is what we thought was destroyed in the Second World War, was actually preserved. And it was then basically taken this now at the Frobenius Institute as well, and it's part of the digitization. So I said that's something that we did and worked, as I said earlier, with the Munich institution as well. So all of that was digitized as part of this project. Everything was transcribed and translated and annotated in a database, in a node-gold database. So it's a relational database. It's a system from a Dutch company, and it's supposedly mostly there for social science and humanities project. But it allows us basically to put objects in there, photographs, and so on, and all the archival materials and have them cross-reference, in there. And this is something that I, for example, like work with at the moment as well. So that's all, and that is then also that what is available to the corporations. So and as I said, so all the materials go in there. So here's Agnes Schulz again. So as you say, you can go images from Agnes Schulz herself to different outputs that she produced during that time, and to these kind of drawings that she did. And again, here's her. So overall, and I said just always is kind of, they were only in the field for 6 months. But we basically have, written sources. You can see handwritten pages, typed pages. They had typewriters in the field where they wrote up their notes. We have, almost 3,000 photographs. They did paintings in the field, bushcrafts. These are, artifacts, and so on and so on. We actually found also much later that there are even audio recordings, and they were in an archive in Berlin. In the German phonogram archive, because they had wax cylinders in the field where they recorded songs in the field, and we didn't know anything about this, and even which is actually painful to find out. But when they left the country, they basically had to record everything that they took out of the country, in Perth, for the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And there they actually said they had a substantial number of films that they shot there, and these things are completely gone. So we have no idea. They were probably destroyed during the war, so, and that's really painful when you see this kind of, but who knows, maybe it will appear at some point. But what to do with the archive now? For example, they have these kind of publications that their members produced after the war. So when they wrote up their work. So here's by Petrie, Die sterbende Welt, Northwest Australia, was translated without permission from the traditional owners in 2011. And the same with the Wunambal by Lommel. So this is what their main outputs is. So one thing is, and I just want to name and shame here, Hesperian Press for actually republishing all of these kind of books by the expedition members without the permission from traditional owners. So that's why I'm saying, and also then actually having it on their website, at least it was when I did this here, when saying this is a translation of Petrie's important work in a culture now destroyed. So I mean, you cannot be a little more offensive than this. So that's why I'm saying, and it reminds me always of a slide that Leah Umbergai actually did, completely unrelated, when she was talking to archaeologists and rock art researchers in 2019. That she always feels endangered and that they are extinct. And these are the processes, this is how it happens. But it also actually happens when we look at this, the original book here by Petrie, not the translation, just the one, but the translation very similar. When we look at the image, the pictorial language in there. So when we have this here, they all, the men are all in traditional gear. They all basically, there's nothing basically there. There's no station life and so on, because this is a representation of Aboriginal culture as if it's still in the Stone Age. So it's a bit simplified, but if you look at that, they're all basically all the images are only about traditional, so-called traditional culture. But if we look in the original archive that we have, we actually found the visual language is completely different. Yeah, because they actually did a lot of everyday shots in the field, what they actually engage with the individuals they engage with. So there are no names, obviously, as it was at that time in the 50s in the publications, but there are a lot of names of the traditional owners in the field. So there you can see how basically the process going from what they experience in the field and what goes into the publications, how it's sanitized and how it's basically turned into ideological statements. And and in fact the archive material then is actually these kind of very funny episodes where Kleist was actually wanted to copy some rock art, but she was always disturbed by the kids. who was, she couldn't work, and then she gave, unfortunately you can't see that very well, but then she gave the kids, as you do, like some of the, the crayons that she worked with, and they were just happily then, so she, they were drawing themselves, and she could continue work. So, but these kind of vignettes, they don't make it into the publication. And the names of their informants, they're all there, but they don't make it into the publication. So in the publications, it's, the Naringin, the Wunambal. So, they are basically anonymous. There's just the group, and the individual researcher is active describing that, but we know in the field it did not happen like that at all. And it's the same, there's also no information in the publications about how they acquired the ethnographic objects, and our tradition was about the bushcraft, how they were acquired, were they just taken, were they traded, and so on and so on. And we actually, as I said, can't go into the details here, but they're actually different processes that are going on in the field there. And so here's some other examples for this one. And the other thing is, what is actually the personal reflections of their researchers in the field? What is it that they were interested in? And there we, because of the original, their own notes that we now have, we can see actually how these kind of things are actually happening. So it's not just the objective scientists going there, but there are things developing in the field. And one thing that's like from the rock art side of things, so if there are any, like Emily, maybe you about the, the Wion Bradshaw discussion, and this is actually the time, it could be its own paper, where Schulz is in the literature actually being said that she was the first in her publication in '56 using the term Bradshaw art, but she in fact, it seems to be also the first person to actually report the Aboriginal terminology, the kuyon, in the field, and that's like sometimes lessly forgotten. And we can also reconstruct with the Aboriginal people that were interacting with her. So it's not actually the Aboriginal people as an amorphous thing, but they were specific individuals. And we also have doubts that these individuals were probably not, were actually not allowed to talk about the meanings when they were there. So that's something that also our collaborators were saying, that they were not authorized to talk about that. And that is then turned into this kind of really bigger picture as if traditional owners overall had nothing to say about the art, and that's kind of like really what we can do. And this is something that I'm working on at the moment. So there's another exhibition. I think I'm doing terribly with time, right? Yes. Okay. So so this is kind of that. Sorry, it's a lot in there. So we did another exhibition here where we also had showed the European audience all the permissions that have to go in the zone to make clear that these are not just images and paintings here on the wall, but they have really significance for traditional owners. So that's kind of what we did here. So as I said, more consultations with traditional owners. And so this is then maybe, hopefully you haven't been waiting too long for this, because it was all on the advertising material. But this is when we made the decision how to actually make people, traditional owners, aware of what is in the archive. Yeah. So how do you actually do this? And there is Leah had the idea, why not? Because as I said, there are in the archive these kind of big reproductions of rock art that were repainted in the field. Yeah, and there's about 150 of them. There are small ones, there are enormous ones like this one here. And they just said, like, why not making a spontaneous, there was a spontaneous idea, but making an exhibition, a presentation of that in this one shed, because we basically reprinted all of them there's obviously not the originals, but on this kind of material that is very sturdy and can be used for exhibitions and so on. So we brought them, and they were basically then put up into this is the Wilinggin shed, with the Aboriginal Corporation, and they just laid out so people could just come for a week and just basically engage with that on their terms. Yeah. So, and that's kind of, this is not, obviously it's not just our decision, but that's then with the traditional owners. They thought, the rangers but it's a great idea. And this really made then people aware of what is actually in the archive. Yeah. So one of the aspects that is there, because if you just, so to speak, have, here's another example here. And as I said, some of them are really enormous because they were copied basically to scale in there. And that allowed then, people to really think about that. And of course, taking more time think about what is there. I mean, we also did, of course, the more traditional engagement here, the Sam Lovell, for example, looking at the photographic archive where you can't print, obviously everything, but on the screen and going through that, correcting information and seeing, where certain sites are and so on and so on. So we did that as well. But I think especially this was really like something that we had not planned from the outset, but this came from the initiative from our partners, basically that they wanted that to happen. So, and we did that with the other corporations as well. Wunambal, Gaambera, they are not that many, there are no large scale, like bigger representation, but there are smaller ones. But we also then presented that in this way, where people can also basically physically engage with that. So it's not just a screen, but it's a physical, so can take that in the hand. And so I said here, and I think in there. So another thing, what we finally did at the end of last year was actually revisiting a few sites where the Germans visited. And that, as I said, took 2 years. And of course, there was COVID in between. So last year, we managed then with Rona and Ninja to actually visit the site and talk through basically, how they see the interactions of traditional owners in the field with the German researchers on site. Yeah. And so we had all the materials there in the field. And this also, they gave us more of an idea of how they think actually what happened in the field. And these are all processes, of course, that are usually not accessible to the publications. As I say, we tried bringing all of the information either on the laptop or then printed out to enable then to reconstruct, as I said, something that we want to do, what happened really on site. And there's some very interesting results out of that as well. So another thing, just maybe because I think I need to wrap up some of things, because we left, of course, this kind of big printouts there. So here, the Wilinggin Aboriginal Corporation office, they actually used that to put these rock art copies up on the walls in their big office, which of course is for us great to see how these kind of things embraced by here our collaborators. And they also put one of these images on their healthy country plan, which is then going to be active for the next 10 years. So it's also this kind of like embracing this. And also here, what is important is not only it's about the rock art, of course, and something, but of course, some of here our collaborators here, Rosalind, Angelina, that is for the first time, so it's one of their, is here father and grandfather, basically for the first time they actually have images of them, their photo and, both the photo and the drawing, and they're really like thrilled and happy, very, very happy to see that for the first time in there. So finally, and then, wrapping up this at the end of October, so basically from 1st of November, we're now going to have an exhibition on this project in Frankfurt in the Museum of World Culture, the Kulturmorphol. And at the end of last year, there were 4 traditional owners for an artist residency in Frankfurt. I unfortunately wasn't there, so I couldn't make it, but they were like creating new artworks in relation then to the materials that were created back then. And so to basically make clear that this is not something that is just in the past, but it's a living culture, it's a living engagement. The Wunanders are still, powerful and there. So that's going to be happening in Frankfurt at the end of this year, and it's probably open then for half a year. So basically, I have this, or the challenges. Maybe I don't need to talk through all this, but so I'm just saying, because I'm running out of time, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Martin. That was wonderful. We've got about 10 minutes for some questions. So are there any questions from you? Oh, who is up first? I think you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Martin, you talked about it a bit already that as you went on, you found more archival stuff in different places. Have you looked or have you found more outside of Germany as well, knowing that sometimes the records are split or mentioned in other places too?
And this course would be, don't mention it, would be my task. So in where we know that they traded objects to I think to the British Museum or to the UK and to Italy, because that is actually something that is sometimes mentioned in the original in the field notes by saying, I got this great something, it will be great for our exchange. So because that's what they did back then. No, but we haven't. So maybe the colleagues have done that, but it hasn't been a focus. But it's not that much has been basically. It's just individual objects, and so and that's why I'm saying don't mention because I think it's actually the Australian institutions outside of Perth that we need to look actually into. Because there is, maybe, I don't know, maybe even the German embassy has an archive because they did a courtesy call. So, Petrie and Fox, they traveled to Canberra and Sydney to meet Elkin and then the German embassy. So then, and they say they have a painting that they gave the Australians, so I can't remember exactly, but I mean that would be interesting too. So there might be still some things happening, but I mean, and we had but it was also defined when we had in the State Archive in Perth. This is kind of where we suddenly had 200 pages of correspondence from them, but also internally, and that was where we, for example, got the research agreement that they had to sign. They signed with the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and what is the framework that they worked in. And this is kind of where we also get the list of all the materials that they got out of they took to Germany, and some of it's there, and some of them is actually lost. Yeah.
Jen and then Kelly. Sorry.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for the talk. When I first saw the slide with the Kulturmuseum, I thought, I know the history of activating the archive there, of generating new work out of museum collections. So I was really glad to see that come up at the end, which makes me wonder if there's another fold back into your project. If as you start to see how your project partners, collaborators start to work with the archive and treat the archive not as a repository of dead objects, but rather forms of enlivening potential. How might this enlivening potential reshape your approach to the archive, your historical approach? Is there, I guess I'm just asking, is there a potential fallback mechanism there that makes the intellectual project of collaboration even richer?
Well, definitely. I mean, there are different sides of that because I mean, there's one side I would respond to this is kind of course, the colleagues in the German Museum. How they will change. So are you asking like in general or me?
Well, I mean, I appreciate that you're doing a historical research, but given the fold through the present and the stakes for the people, your collaborators in the present, if that might actually help to, re-envisage a liveliness within your own archaeological project.
Okay, well, this one, I mean, this, as I said, the one thing is that for the German institutions, there's this side of things, but the other thing is that what happened in the field, but this is something I need to be careful not to claim this because it's our PhD student, Christina, she worked very in the field with the traditional owners, and they actually said in this spirit, they actually said we need to flip around and not follow the, basically the travels of the Germans in the field, but she, there was Rona who said that they actually think they need to follow the travels of the of the Wunambal, of the spirit, the ancestors, because they think they were actually guided by the ancestors. So, and we, of course, thinking about, okay, in our archive goes like, where were they at what time and were they following and how they went from one side to the other. but they were saying, no, we actually need to take that around because there's a narrative in country that needs to be followed. And but I have to say, you know, I haven't got my head around that, but that I don't know if that answers your question, but that's exactly that kind of input that, as I said, no, I have actually not intensely worked at that time, so I left it to her. But that would be something where now, yeah, we need to see if we take that influence and then maybe rethink how we approach, you know, the materials. Yeah. So, but I can't tell you how it would work. But this is the input. Yeah.
We're going to go a little bit over time, so is there any questions online? No, okay. Kelly.
I just want to make a comment on Emily's question too, and then I'll ask a question. So in terms of, you know, could materials be in other institutions outside of Germany and this kind of thing? In my work on the Tiwi Islands, and when we did the archive research, we discovered that Tiwi material culture is spread across European institutions in different countries. And then I was looking at the books online at the Institute, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and there's this book in there that describes a Tiwi collection in the Vatican. And I mean, the Tiwi Islands had all that Catholic missionary history, so you could sort of piece it together how it would have made its way to, you know, the Vatican, this kind of thing. But if there were missionaries up there in the Kimberley at the time, and the Germans were doing their ethnographic work, might be possible for some of the materials to be, you know, across in those institutions as well.
No, there is a Kimberley collection in the Vatican from Kalamburu, I think. But this we're not dealing with that because this is kind of what we are not looking for all Wandjina Unwood collections anywhere in the world. We are just basically looking at this, you know, that context, and it's already that I will have to work on this for the rest of my life. Just what they produced in 2 times 6 months, you know. So it's kind of weird when you want to disentangle all of the relationships. You know, I see that they're going into the situation, then coming out of that, and then of course, you know, what kind of impact has it on traditional owners? What has it on you know, on different institutions? So but I know that there is in the Vatican, there's Kimberley.
And also just quickly, I mean, digital repatriation isn't the answer to every Aboriginal community's you know, aspirations for return of material culture, and also across the different classes of material items. You know, digital repatriation is going to appeal to everybody. But with these countries that you work with the digitization, is it mainly dealing with archive records, written records, photography records, this kind of thing, and not, for example, material culture?
No, as well. No. So I mean, our partners, they always call what I could call objects or artifacts. They call it bushcraft. And they are in our database as well. And so I mean, they're just like, you know, searchable and, you know, show up with images in the database. And talking of, you know, no, I agree with the digital repatriation with this. So this is again is a starting point, you know, to start a conversation, because as I said, for these people, you know, they had, you know, for 85 years or how long it is, had no idea that this archive exists, you know. So and now this takes some time to make that decision. What do they want to do with that? And I think, you know, so when I said earlier, the topic of physical repatriation hasn't come up, but it might, you know. So if more engagement will happen, and then now for the opening, more traditional owners will hopefully travel to Frankfurt, look at the thing, and then, you know, that will start conversations. And so I think it might well be that they will decide certain bushcraft items, or they should go back to country. Yeah.
We can go on, Sam. I'll come back to you in a minute. But just because we've got people online, and we're now 11:30, I do stay. We'll have questions after, but I do want to thank Martin for a wonderful talk. It's so nice for the Institute to have such a vigorous conversation in what spans the humanities and social sciences. It's lovely to see this enliven itself in the Institute. So thank you, Kelly Pollard, for facilitating Martin coming up. and visiting us, first time in Darwin. And thank you for that wonderful tour.